Get cozy under a thick quilt. Close your eyes and picture yourself whisked away to the vibrant core of Manhattan in those closing weeks of 1947. The horrors of World War II have at last receded, ushering in a wave of hopefulness as veterans reunite with loved ones in warm homes. The avenues pulse with energy, filled not with the wail of alerts, but with the joyful chatter of youngsters discovering a world of tranquility over threat. Storefronts on Fifth Avenue sparkle with festive illuminations, throwing a warm amber light across the sidewalks below. At Rockefeller Center, an enormous Norway spruce, taller and more splendid than in recent years, towers above the ice rink, its branches heavy with countless glowing lights that twinkle like stars against the night sky. Manhattan thrums with a distinctive post-war vibe, the lively improvisations of emerging bebop tunes from hidden clubs, the buzz of a surging economy promising prosperity, and the swirl of tobacco fumes blending with the dazzling signs of Times Square and Broadway theaters. This was an age of renewal and celebration, with cultural shifts like the rise of abstract expressionism drawing artists to the city, and the United Nations beginning construction as a symbol of global cooperation. Yet, far offshore, in the shadowy expanses of the Atlantic, a powerful weather phenomenon was gathering strength unnoticed. In contrast to modern tempests monitored by orbiting satellites and constant media updates, this one advanced in near secrecy, beyond the grasp of 1940s technology. No gusts shook the buildings, no urgent alerts broke into evening radio shows. December 25th passed as a typical drowsy day after the festivities. Households sorted through leftovers from roast dinners, kids assembled new model train sets or arranged doll collections, and workers geared up to resume routines in offices and plants. The U.S. Weather Bureau issued a reassuring outlook: overcast skies with scattered light flurries, anticipating only a thin layer that would melt away by sunrise, though internal models hinted at a slim possibility of up to 15 inches. Unseen by experts, an uncommon and explosive clash of air masses was unfolding. A frigid Arctic front plunged southward from Canada, slamming into a humid flow rising from the warm Gulf Stream waters. This merger sparked explosive cyclogenesis, a swift drop in central pressure of at least 24 millibars in 24 hours, fueling a low-pressure center that zeroed in on the northeast like a targeted strike, amplified by the ocean's moisture. As the system reached the coast, it arrived not with hurricane-like rage, but a misleading calm. Flakes descended in a steady, dense curtain, layering up quietly and relentlessly, reaching rates of up to 3 inches hourly without much breeze to scatter them. When morning light filtered through on December 26th, official measurements in Central Park hit an astonishing 26.4 inches over roughly 24 hours, surpassing the 1888 storm's 21 inches in total depth, though milder in winds and cold. Entrance steps to subways vanished beneath drifts. Around 30,000 vehicles were left stranded mid-journey, turning thoroughfares into landscapes of snow-covered mounds. The metropolis, renowned for its non-stop pace, ground to a halt. An eerie hush enveloped everything, a deep, absorbing stillness that those who experienced it likened to a vast padding of fabric, muffling the urban roar into an almost supernatural peace. Snuggle in a little closer, let the glow of your screen be the only light in the room, and allow yourself to fall fully into that crystalline pause in time when the greatest city on earth was humbled not by bombs or bankruptcy, but by millions of silent, perfect snowflakes. This is a tale stitched from opposites: exasperation and wonder, standstill and solidarity, the moment when every gear in the machine of progress seized and people remembered they still knew how to be neighbors. Before we wade deeper into those waist-high drifts of 1947, tell me in the comments, where are you riding out this blizzard with me tonight? I love watching the map light up. Sydney, Sao Paulo, Stockholm, Seattle, little beacons proving that a good snow story still belongs to the whole world. Now draw the blanket higher, mute the 21st century, and step with me into a city dipped in amber streetlight and sudden, shocking quiet. To grasp how completely the storm blindsided New York, we first have to feel the pulse of the place in the weeks before Christmas 1947. This was not merely a city running smoothly, it was a city drunk on possibility. The war was over, the lights were back on, literally and figuratively, and Manhattan radiated the bright, slightly dizzy confidence of a champion who has just realized the fight is finally finished. December 1947 felt like the nation's first full breath in 6 years. Ration books had been tossed into trash cans, blackout curtains taken down, and the dread of Western Union telegrams replaced by the clatter of wedding bells. GIs poured off troop ships at Pier 90, duffel bags slung over shoulders, ready to marry, to build, to spend. Across the river in Queens and out on Long Island, brand new Levittown houses were rising almost overnight to house them. In the factories of Brooklyn and the Bronx, assembly lines that once turned out Sherman tanks now rolled out gleaming Frigidaire refrigerators and sleek new Chevrolets. The unemployment rate had plummeted, paychecks were fat, and overtime was plentiful. Culturally, the city was on fire. Down on Swing Street, West 52nd, between 5th and 7th, clubs like the Three Deuces and the Onyx featured Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and Thelonious Monk inventing bebop in smoky, ecstatic real time. Up in Harlem, the Apollo Theater was packed every night. On Broadway, Oklahoma was still selling out 4 years into its run, while new shows, Streetcar Named Desire had opened just weeks earlier, promised a grittier, more electric theater. And out on First Avenue, bulldozers were clearing 18 acres of old slaughterhouses and breweries so the United Nations could plant its flag and declare New York the unofficial capital of the post-war world. Christmas 1947 carried extra weight. It was the first unrestricted holiday in a decade. No more saving sugar coupons for a single cake. No more victory trees decorated with paper because metal ornaments had gone to the war effort. Department stores unleashed a decade's worth of pent-up magic. Macy's unveiled 8 animated windows on 34th Street that drew 500,000 people in the first week alone. One tableau featured a life-size Santa piloting a gleaming locomotive through a miniature Rocky Mountain pass. Saks had a 20-foot-tall mechanical Christmas tree that revolved while toy soldiers marched in perfect formation. Lord & Taylor's windows told the entire Nutcracker story, with puppets so delicate they seemed to breathe. Inside those stores, the air was thick with pine, perfume, and the brassy cheer of Salvation Army bands. Cash registers rang like church bells. Pneumatic tubes overhead whooshed cylinders of money and change, and elevator operators in white gloves announced each floor like town criers. 5th floor, toys, dolls, Lionel trains, flexible flyer sleds. Clerks tied packages with real ribbon, not the wartime paper string, and every purchase felt like proof that the good times were here to stay. Out on the sidewalks, the city smelled like a holiday postcard come to life. Roasted chestnuts, wet wool, hot coffee from chock-full-of-nuts counters, the metallic tang of the 3rd Avenue L, and underneath it all, the faint, briny bite of the Hudson and East Rivers. Steam rose in great white plumes from manhole covers, catching the neon of theater marquees and turning ordinary corners into fleeting stage sets. Men in snap-brim hats and D-mob overcoats strode past women in victory roll hair and bright red lipstick, everyone moving with the quick, purposeful gait of people who had survived something enormous and now intended to live twice as loudly to make up for it. This was the New York that went to bed on Christmas night 1947, stuffed with turkey and fruitcake, certain that tomorrow would bring nothing worse than a few picturesque flakes. Above every rooftop and spire, Manhattan wore light the way royalty wears jewels. From 34th Street all the way to 59th, Fifth Avenue was laced with thick ropes of pine garland and velvet bows the size of Buicks. Street lamps wore halos of frost, and every lamppost seemed to have sprouted its own miniature Christmas tree. Yet nothing rivaled the spectacle at Rockefeller Center. The 1947 tree, a 75-foot Norway spruce hauled in from a Long Island estate, rose like a living chandelier above the golden Prometheus. Its branches sagged under the weight of more than 7,000 incandescent bulbs, their glow fracturing across the rink into a million tiny rainbows. Skaters below traced lazy infinity loops, scarves flying, while onlookers on the promenade cradled paper cups of cocoa topped with real whipped cream, certain that winter had decided to be gentle this year. The season had been unusually mild. Only a handful of nights had dipped below 20 degrees. New York, spoiled by kindness, let its guard down completely. Forecasting in 1947 was still closer to divination than science. No ring of satellites stared down from geostationary orbit. No radar domes painted the sky in greens and purples. No ensemble models spat out probability cones. Instead, a few dozen men in sleeve garters hunched over hand-plotted charts in a Weather Bureau office on Whitehall Street, piecing together puzzle pieces that arrived hours late on chattering teletype rolls. Out over the Atlantic, hundreds of miles of empty water, there simply was no one to phone in a report. Merchant ships, fishing trawlers, and the occasional transatlantic liner were the only eyes, and they could be 1,000 miles apart. A storm could be born, grow teeth, and sprint toward the coast without ever appearing on a map. So, on Christmas night, the official word remained soothingly bland. Cloudy, occasional light snow, becoming partly cloudy by afternoon. The New York Times printed it without alarm. Radio announcers read it between Bing Crosby records. No one stockpiled canned goods, no one salted sidewalks. Children fell asleep dreaming of new Schwinn bicycles, not of shovels. The ingredients for catastrophe, meanwhile, were sliding into perfect alignment. A lobe of dense Arctic air, some of the coldest of the young winter, had broken off the polar vortex and was knifing south across Quebec, carrying temperatures as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit at its core. At the same time, the western Atlantic was running 2 to 4 degrees warmer than normal, supercharging the Gulf Stream. That warm ocean acted like an open furnace door, hurling moisture skyward in invisible plumes. When the two giants collided just southeast of Cape Hatteras, the atmosphere did not produce a broad, sloppy winter storm. It detonated a meteorological grenade. In 24 hours, the central pressure plummeted more than 30 millibars, well beyond the modern threshold for bomb cyclone. A tight, almost perfectly circular low formed a mere 100 miles off Long Island, spinning counterclockwise like a drill bit. Yet because the pressure gradient between the low and the stout high-pressure dome over Canada was unusually narrow, winds at the surface stayed strangely modest, rarely above 30 miles per hour in the city itself. The storm never roared. It simply opened its mouth and exhaled snow, thick, wet, windless columns of it, straight down, hour after hour. This was the trait that stunned even seasoned weathermen. Most big coastal storms arrive with drama, howling gusts, horizontal snow, barometers crashing like cymbals. This one arrived like a librarian shushing a noisy room. The flakes were enormous, some the size of $50, and they fell in such density that streetlights at noon looked like candles seen through frosted glass. Central Park's official rate peaked at just over 3 inches an hour for several consecutive hours, a pace almost unheard of outside the Great Lakes snowbelts. It was less a snowstorm than a slow-motion avalanche from the sky. By the time New Yorkers opened their curtains on the morning of the 26th, the city they thought they knew had vanished under a seamless white sea, and it was breathtakingly, heartbreakingly quiet. On Christmas night, 1947, nobody was thinking about isobars or latent heat release. Inside the walk-ups of Yorkville and the stately row houses of Brooklyn Heights, the only glow that mattered came from the dial of a Philco or Zenith console. Bing Crosby's velvet voice floated out of cloth-covered speakers, assuring everyone that he was dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones he used to know, while Jack Benny cracked wise on the Kraft Music Hall. The living rooms smelled of pine needles, cigar smoke, and the lingering sweetness of mincemeat pie. Dads loosened their ties and unfolded the Bulldog edition of the Journal-American. Mothers rinsed bone china plates under hot water that still felt like a luxury after years of rationing. Upstairs, kids finally surrendered to sleep, one arm locked around a new Roy Rogers cowboy doll or a gleaming American Flyer locomotive. Out on the stoops and fire escapes, a few idle flakes drifted through the cones of the street lamps, big slow-motion stars that melted the moment they touched a man's fedora or the hood of a parked DeSoto. It was exactly the postcard scene people had wished for. A polite after-dinner dusting, the kind that made the brownstones look like gingerbread houses for an hour or two, and then politely disappeared. Snow shovels stayed propped in cellar corners next to last summer's lawnmower. No one phoned the coal yard for an emergency ton. Delivery trucks were already loaded with Friday's freight, crates of California oranges, sides of beef, new wash tubs from Montgomery Ward. New York, the city that bragged it was ready for anything, went to bed smug and unsuspecting. It was the quietest invasion in history. No sirens, no thunder, just the soft, methodical erasure of a metropolis while its 8 million citizens dreamed. Morning came with the usual clatter of alarm clocks, West clocks, Big Bens and Baby Bens rattling on nightstands across the 5 boroughs. Friday the 26th, back to work. The holiday was officially over. The registers had to open, the ledgers had to balance, the paychecks had to be earned. In apartment kitchens, percolators burbled and cast-iron radiators clanked awake. Men knotted ties in front of steamed-up mirrors. Women pinned victory rolls and dabbed on tangy lipstick the color of ripe persimmons. Shop owners turned keys in double locks, dreaming of post-Christmas bargain hunters. Factory whistles were primed to scream at 8 sharp. Kids who had drawn the lucky straw of a day off plotted trips to Macy's return counter or begged mothers for a spin around Central Park on brand-new metal roller skates, skates it would spend the next week gathering dust on a closet shelf. The sky at dawn was the color of the inside of an oyster shell, flat and luminous. Snow still fell, but lazily now, almost playfully. Flakes the size of communion wafers twirled down, hesitated, and vanished on contact with streets still radiating yesterday's mildness. To anyone glancing out a streetcar window or from behind the counter of a corner luncheonette, it looked harmless, pretty even. Sanitation crews rolled past in their orange trucks, plows raised high, more for show than necessity. Checker cabs honked and fishtailed for sport. Newsboys on the corners shouted the morning headlines. Truman's latest speech. The Dodgers may be moving to Los Angeles someday, while the city's great engine revved up exactly on schedule. No one yet understood that the engine was already seized solid, buried under a snowfall that had only just begun to flex its muscles. As the percolators went cold and the second cigarette of the morning burned down to a stub, something shifted overhead. The sky didn't just cloud over, it sank. The whole lid of the atmosphere seemed to drop a few hundred feet, pressing its weight against the Chrysler Spire and the new towers rising along Park Avenue. The playful flurries thickened into a solid, moving sheet, and the city's constant growl began to dull, as though someone had slipped a wool blanket over every horn, engine, and shouting vendor. By 11 o'clock, even the most hurried New Yorker had to admit this was no longer scenery. Snow was winning. It lay in thick, wet slabs on hoods and awnings, refusing to melt. Cabbies hunched over steering wheels, wipers thumping uselessly against a white paste that reformed the instant it was cleared. Doormen who had laughed off the first flakes now attacked their marble steps with push brooms and rock salt, only to watch the cleared patches disappear again in minutes. On the sidewalks, strangers caught each other's eyes in that particular tribal way city people do when the social contract is suddenly rewritten. A quick lift of the eyebrows, a shrug that said, "They didn't call for this, did they?" Everyone still believed the punchline was coming. Any minute now, the clouds would thin, the plows would roll, and the story would be good for a laugh at the water cooler tomorrow. The sky, however, had settled in for the duration. What made the storm so treacherous was what it refused to do. It never raged. There were no 60-mile-an-hour gusts whipping down the avenues, no horizontal blades of ice to rattle the windows of the Flatiron Building. The wind gauge at Central Park barely twitched above 15 miles an hour all day. The temperatures sat stubbornly at 26 to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to keep everything frozen, warm enough to load every flake with water. The result was a snowfall of almost impossible efficiency, straight down, no drift, no mercy. By early afternoon, the individual flakes surrendered their individuality and arrived as sodden clumps, some as big as poker chips, some the size of saucers, slapping onto overcoats with a wet thud you could feel through wool and lining. 3 inches an hour, then 3.5. The measuring stick in Central Park had to be cleared every 60 minutes or the numbers became meaningless. Cars parked along the curbs vanished first into low white dunes, then into smooth, anonymous hills. A brand new 1947 Kaiser Frazer on East 72nd Street disappeared so completely that its owner walked past it twice before realizing the mound in front of his own brownstone was his car. The sound of the city changed first, then the light. The usual metallic clatter softened into a dull, cottony hush. Horns sounded miles away as if broadcast through pillows. Neon signs that normally blazed crimson and cobalt now glowed dimly through a moving veil like lanterns seen from underwater. People stopped dead on corners, mouths half open, caught between irritation and something close to reverence. A secretary on her way to the corner deli for a chicken salad sandwich found herself suddenly knee-deep on Madison Avenue and laughed out loud, an involuntary, almost frightened sound that echoed strangely far. Kids, of course, thought the world had been handed to them on a platter. They tunneled, they pelted one another with snowballs the size of cantaloupes, they lay on their backs in the middle of Lexington Avenue and made angels where yellow cabs were supposed to be. For the adults, the spell lasted a little longer, maybe until the streetlights flickered on at 4 o'clock and revealed a city already unrecognizable. Then the paralysis set in for real. Streetcars threw blue sparks and stalled mid-block, their trolleys frozen to the wires. Buses jackknifed and simply died, drivers climbing out to stare helplessly at wheels buried to the hubcaps. Even the subway, the indestructible vein that had kept New York alive through depression and war, began to choke. Open stairwells at elevated stations filled like bathtubs, third rail shoes iced over, signal systems shorted out. Commuters who had fought their way back from lunch trudged into lobbies looking like survivors of the Klondike, stomping avalanches off galoshes while elevators stood frozen between floors. This was not, by the book, a blizzard. A blizzard needs sustained winds over 35 miles an hour and visibility under a quarter mile for 3 hours straight. The great snow of '47 never qualified. What it was, instead, was a slow-motion burial, an atmospheric fire hose aimed squarely at the 5 boroughs and left running for 24 hours. Modern analysis has given the storm a dozen technical names: bomb cyclone, coastal frontogenesis, extreme upslope precipitation event. But the cleanest description remains the one old-timers still use. The sky fell, and it never bothered to shout a warning. 3 invisible forces had lined up with the neatness of a bank vault combination. First, the western Atlantic was running fever warm, 4 degrees above normal, turning the coastal waters into a giant evaporator. Second, a brick wall ridge of high pressure parked itself over Labrador and northern Quebec, shoving a tongue of bitter Arctic air straight down the Hudson Valley. Third, a weak disturbance riding along the stalled front ignited the whole mixture like a match held to gasoline vapors. The result was a bullseye low that deepened explosively just 60 miles southeast of Montauk, then sat there, almost motionless, wringing out every drop of moisture the ocean could feed it. New York never saw it coming because in 1947 no one could, and by the time the city understood what was happening, it was already too late to do anything but watch the white take over. The third and most lethal piece of the puzzle was the one no one could see from a window. The atmosphere upstairs had locked itself into a classic omega block, a pattern that meteorologists today still regard with a shiver. A massive ridge of high pressure planted itself over Labrador and Greenland like a boulder in a stream. Normally, low-pressure systems zip along the jet stream and kick out to sea within a day. This one hit the wall and stopped dead, pinned roughly 70 miles southeast of Montauk for nearly 30 hours. It became a stationary moisture pump, vacuuming warm Atlantic vapor and wringing it out over the same 5 boroughs again and again in a closed, merciless loop. Because the storm refused to budge, the usual fierce pressure gradient never developed. Winds in Manhattan itself rarely topped 20 miles an hour. That eerie calm was the final trick. In a normal nor'easter, the gusts would have sculpted fantastic drifts and scoured other areas bare. Here, every flake that fell stayed exactly where it landed. The snow simply rose straight up in perfect stratigraphic layers, almost geological in their tidiness. Central Park's rulers had to be emptied every hour, sometimes twice, or the totals would have been buried along with everything else. The final mark of 26.4 inches, later adjusted to 26.9 in some reanalyses, would stand as New York City's single-day record until February 2006. On the ground, though, denial ran deep. New York had stared down U-bunks, blackouts, and breadlines. A little snow wasn't going to rattle it. As drifts climbed past boot tops and then past knees in the late afternoon, people still talked about waiting it out. Radio stations read the same noon forecast into the evening because the teletype lines were clogged and no one at the Weather Bureau had the heart or the fresh data to contradict it. Commuters slogging toward Grand Central or Times Square treated the deepening slush as a personal insult rather than a historic event. They had no idea the storm was now in its ferocious, mature stage, dumping at rates that would have made lake-effect towns along Erie blush. The surrender came, not with a bang, but with a slow, collective exhale. First, the legs gave out. Every step became a lunge, then a crawl. Then the ears noticed the silence. No horns, no streetcar bells, just the soft, wet thud of snow on snow. Tires spun themselves bald, trying to climb invisible curbs. Buses and taxis were simply abandoned mid-block, engines ticking as they cooled under growing white domes. Drivers pocketed the keys, or didn't bother, and vanished into the nearest bar or subway entrance, only to discover that those entrances had become smooth, slippery chutes plunging into darkness. And then, in the vacuum left by machines, the city remembered it was still human. Fifth Avenue, the canyon of Capitol, turned into an impromptu ski slope. Teenagers who had received flexible flyer skis for Christmas clicked into bindings on the corner of 50th Street and shoosed south past St. Patrick's Cathedral, weaving between marooned Packards, while stunned pedestrians applauded from half-buried doorways. A man in a raccoon coat and Homburg was photographed gliding down Broadway on cross-country boards, briefcase tucked under one arm like a football. Horses, yes, still a few left pulling produce carts in 1947, were unhitched and ridden bareback through the whitening chaos because hooves worked better than wheels. By 5 o'clock, the great stores pulled their gates. Macy's, Gimbel's, Saks, places that normally stayed open until 9 for post-holiday returns, simply locked up and turned the lights down to a glow. Inside, stranded shoppers and clerks formed impromptu communities around the cosmetic counters, sharing thermos coffee and rumors. Restaurants became dormitories. Bartenders at Tooth Shores and Jack Dempsey's stopped charging after a while and just kept pouring. The marquees on 42nd Street stayed lit, but the streets below them were empty, except for the occasional ghost-like figure wading waist-deep, flashlight in hand. The subway, the one system New Yorkers swore could never fail, finally met its match in those open stairwells. Snow didn't just pile on the sidewalks, it poured downward in heavy, wet avalanches, packing each flight of steps solid. By nightfall, many entrances were indistinguishable from the drifts around them, smooth white ramps that ended in a black hole. Commuters arriving topside stared in disbelief at what had been a staircase an hour earlier and was now a luge run. Trains still ran underground, but the city above had no way to reach them. Thousands were marooned on platforms or simply gave up and started walking home, 10, 15, 20 blocks, through a landscape that no longer had streets, only suggestions. In that early twilight, the sun gave up around 4:30, and the street lamps came on to illuminate nothing but falling walls of white. The greatest metropolis in the world admitted defeat. Not to an enemy army, not to depression or war, but to 26 inches of the quietest, heaviest, most polite snow it had ever met. And in that surrender, something strange and almost beautiful happened. The city that never slept simply closed its eyes for the first time in its adult life, wrapped in a blanket no one had asked for, but no one could refuse. Deep beneath the streets, the subway trains kept their ancient schedules for a little while longer, clattering through tunnels that smelled of ozone and wet wool, doors opening onto platforms that fewer and fewer people could reach. Up top, every stairway had become a losing proposition. Transit crews attacked the steps with shovels and brooms, clearing a narrow channel down to the handrails, only to look back 20 minutes later and see the passage erased again, smoothed over as neatly as if it had never been touched. Some gave up and simply stood under the kiosks, smoking in silence, watching the snow win. On the surface, the surrender was total and strangely orderly. Streetcars froze where they stopped, their trolley poles sparking uselessly against iced wires. Buses slid sideways into one another like slow-motion collisions, then sat steaming in the middle of intersections, abandoned. Checker cabs, more than 10,000 of them across the city, were left with doors ajar and meters still running until the drivers realized no fare was worth this. Keys were pocketed, fares were forgotten, and the cabbies vanished into the white on foot. Milk trucks, coal trucks, bakery vans, all stalled in perfect motionless rows, their cargo slowly freezing solid a few cruel blocks from the people who needed it most. Walking became a full-body negotiation. Sidewalks were a rumor. The distinction between street and curb had vanished hours earlier. Every stride meant lifting the knee almost to the chest, plunging the leg down into heavy, wet cement, then wrenching it free again. A 10-block trip home turned into an hour-long expedition. Women in pumps and seamed nylons gave up on dignity, hoisted their skirts, and marched like soldiers. Men in wingtips and Homburgs discovered muscles they hadn't used since basic training. Even the sky closed. At LaGuardia, crews with new rotary plows fought heroic, hopeless battles to keep at least one runway open. The snow simply laughed and filled the cleared strip again before the plow reached the far end. Over in Queens, the half-finished runways of Idlewild, still 2 years from its grand opening, were already lost under drifts deep enough to swallow a DC-6 to the propellers. The big silver birds sat chained to the ground, their aluminum skins frosted into sculptures. And then the sound died. New York had never known true silence before, not like this. Without wind to move it, the snow absorbed everything. Horns, voices, the metallic shriek of brakes, even the heartbeat of the city itself. The thick white layer acted like felt on a piano hammer. A man on 57th Street claimed he could hear a dog barking 6 blocks away, as clearly as if it stood at his feet. Another swore he heard his own pulse. The absence of noise was so complete that it felt louder than noise ever had. From the 30th floor windows of Midtown offices, the view looked apocalyptic and absurdly beautiful. Secretaries and executives stared down at avenues that had become slot canyons of white, the yellow cabs reduced to scattered gumdrops under confectioner's sugar. Many delayed leaving, hoping for a lull that never came. When they finally stepped out, they dropped waist-deep into drifts where the lobby doors had been, gasping at the cold shock of reality. The clothes of 1947 were a cruel joke against this kind of cold. Men's overcoats were heavy but not waterproof. Fedoras turned into wet felt bowls. Women's rayon stockings wicked moisture upward until legs went numb. Yet people helped one another without hesitation. Arms linked, shoulders offered, strangers forming human chains to cross what had once been Lexington Avenue. The shared exhaustion created instant intimacy. No one stood on ceremony when survival was measured in blocks. But if the streets fell quiet, the great rail terminals turned into roaring encampments. Grand Central and Penn Station, those marble cathedrals of departure, became cities within the city. Long Island Railroad and New Haven trains stopped coming in. Hudson tubes flooded and shut down. The last New York Central train from Albany limped in at dusk and never left again. 40,000 people who had planned to be home for supper realized they would not sleep in their own beds. The starry ceiling of the main concourse looked down on a sea of bodies instead of travelers. Bankers used folded Wall Street journals for pillows. Shopgirls curled up inside glass telephone booths for a shred of privacy. Red Cross volunteers who had once staffed blood drives now handed out blankets from Altmans and Gimbels. The oyster bar stayed open all night, ladling clam chowder to anyone with a dime or a hard luck story. Horn and hard art automats kept the coffee flowing and the pie cases unlocked. A rumor swept the hall that a woman on the west balcony had gone into labor. Within minutes, a dozen strangers formed a protective ring, while a doctor who'd been stranded on the 20th Century Limited was located and escorted down. In the midst of the greatest transportation failure the city had ever known, the old wartime reflex kicked in. Take care of each other first, sort the rest out later. The same spirit that had carried New York through blackouts and bond drives now carried it through the snow. Above them all, the storm kept its perfect, terrible silence, as if the sky itself had decided the city needed one night, one single, unforgettable night, to stop talking and simply listen. As true night settled in, an early violet darkness made deeper by the reflected glow of snow, the very idea of home became negotiable. The liveried doormen at the Waldorf Astoria stopped asking for room keys and simply waved people inside. The plush crimson carpet of the lobby was soon dotted with sleeping figures curled beneath borrowed tablecloths. Across the street at the Biltmore, the famous clock became a meeting point for hundreds who spread overcoats on the terrazzo and slept beneath it like pilgrims. Neighborhood cinemas, the Rivoli, the Capitol, the Rialto, never killed the projectors. They just dimmed the house lights and let the same newsreel loop while rows of seats filled with dozing strangers lulled by the flicker. Churches left their doors on the latch and their radiators hissing. Firehouses rolled up the apparatus doors and handed out cocoa in tin cups to anyone who could crowd inside. For the children, though, the laws of physics had been repealed and Santa had come twice. Schools were already closed for the holiday week, and now every street was a slope. Kids who had unwrapped flexible flyer sleds only 24 hours earlier now flew down the broad, carless expanse of Fifth Avenue, screaming past the Plaza Hotel, using the buried hoods of taxis as launch ramps. Central Park became an occupied country of snow forts and tunnels. One enterprising gang on the Upper West Side dug a burrow clean through a drift from 96th Street to 97th. A famous Wire photo the next day showed a boy in a coonskin cap standing triumphantly atop a 10-foot mound that had completely swallowed a police call box. For the adults charged with digging the city out, there was no wonder, only bone-deep fatigue and a growing anger at City Hall. Mayor O'Dwyer's administration had been lulled by the same calm that fooled everyone else. Sanitation Commissioner Mulrain waited for winds that never came, treating the storm like any other manageable squall. Only at 4 p.m. on the 26th, hours too late, did the full emergency call go out. By then, the big plow trucks couldn't even reach the avenues. They were hemmed in by thousands of abandoned vehicles frozen solid in their tracks. Plows that did make it out pushed snow into towering walls that immediately blocked cross streets. In some parts of Brooklyn, residents woke to find their blocks transformed into roofless white tunnels with no way in or out. All through the night, under harsh portable floodlights, sanitation men shoveled in rotating gangs, faces wrapped in scarves against the wet cold. For every ton they lifted, 2 more tons replaced it. When the last flake finally fell around dawn on the 27th, the ruler at Central Park's Belvedere Castle read 26.4 inches. Some unofficial backyard measurements in Queens and Staten Island topped 32. In the narrow streets south of 14th and in the slot canyons of Wall Street, the snow compressed and drifted into 8 and 10-foot ridges that buried storefronts to the second story. The city's emergency arteries clogged just as thoroughly. The old Packard and Cadillac ambulances, high-bodied, rear-wheel drive, no chains, bellied out like boats in sand. Paramedics strapped on snowshoes or simply walked, carrying oxygen bottles and medical bags through drifts that came to their hips. One baby was born on the third-floor landing of a Lower East Side tenement because the ambulance never arrived. The doctor made it on foot from Bellevue, guided by flashlight. Fire rigs fared little better. Ladder trucks were abandoned blocks from the fire. Firemen formed human chains to pass hoses and axes hand over hand through the snow, arriving soaked and gasping. Response times measured in hours instead of minutes. Yet where the official machinery broke down, the unofficial city rose up. The war was only 2 years in the rearview mirror, and people still knew how to act when institutions faltered. Neighbors who had never exchanged more than a nod suddenly introduced themselves over shared shovels. Delicatessens that still had power cooked everything in the cases and carried trays up 5 flights to elderly shut-ins. On the Grand Concourse, a line of teenage boys formed a human sled relay to get a heart attack victim to Montefiore Hospital 2 miles away. In Harlem, the Abyssinian Baptist Church turned its basement into a dormitory and soup kitchen. Downtown, St. Agnes near Grand Central did the same. Stranded sailors from the Brooklyn Navy Yard showed up with Navy duffel bags full of blankets and K-rations. A convoy of Army half-tracks from Fort Totten finally rumbled in at dawn on the 27th, but by then the citizens had already begun rescuing themselves. The great snow didn't just close the city, it stripped away the famous New York armor, the don't talk to strangers rule, the cultivated indifference, and revealed the softer, fiercely communal town that had always lived underneath. For 48 extraordinary hours, the barriers of class, borough, and color thinned under the universal solvent of shared exhaustion and shared wonder. And when the sun finally rose on a blinded, crystalline Manhattan on the morning of the 27th, a sun so bright it hurt the eyes, the silence was still there, deeper than ever. The city looked like a plaster model of itself, every sharp edge rounded, every noise erased. People stepped out of doorways they had tunneled open and simply stared, strangers smiling at strangers, because for one brief moment, everyone understood the same impossible thing. The biggest, loudest, proudest city in the world had been hushed by snow, and in that hush, it had remembered how to be neighbors again. On blocks where people had shared elevator rides for a decade without ever learning each other's names, the morning of the 27th brought sudden introductions. Mrs. Goldstein from 4B and Mr. DiNapoli from 4C found themselves side by side on the front steps at dawn, swinging coal shovels like pickaxes, laughing at the absurdity of finally meeting over a 3-foot wall of snow that blocked their own doorway. The war had taught them ration books and victory gardens. The blizzard taught them their neighbors' first names. Out on the avenues, the automobile became communal property. A black 1946 Chrysler New Yorker buried to its running boards on East 78th wasn't just one man's headache, it was an obstacle to an entire block's freedom. A dozen strangers, a stockbroker still in pinstripes, 2 sailors on leave, a grocer in his bloody apron, simply materialized, dug out the rear wheels with garbage can lids, laid down burlap sacks for traction, and rocked the car free on the 3rd heave. The relieved driver tried to press $5 bills into cold hands, every palm turned over in refusal. "Pay it forward, Mac," was all anyone said. The kids became the city's bloodstream. Gangs of 10 and 12-year-olds, cheeks red as apples, wool caps pulled low, turned their sleds into delivery wagons. They pulled little red flyers loaded with waxed cardboard boxes of coffee and bologna sandwiches from still warm kitchens up to the cops and sanitation men who hadn't sat down in 18 hours. One group on Amsterdam Avenue kept a running tab on a frosted window with a crayon. 47 cups delivered, 12 donuts, 9 slices of salami on rye. When a grateful sergeant tried to salute them, the smallest courier informed him, "We're the 101st Snow Division, sir. Keep digging." Slowly, painfully, the city clawed motion back into itself. The first pathways were only 18 inches wide, narrow trenches hacked through chest-high drifts, forcing everyone into single file like soldiers in a communication line. You met the eyes of every person you passed. There was no choice. A nod, a morning, a shared grunt of effort became the new currency. Cars stayed buried, but people moved again. And the stories multiplied, passed along like contraband cigarettes. In the East Flatbush section of Brooklyn, an elderly widow named Mrs. Rosenbaum stepped off the curb on Kings Highway and dropped out of sight as neatly as if a trap door had opened. Two 13-year-old boys from PS 152, Joey Esposito and Calvin Washington, saw the crown of her black hat disappear. They dove in without discussion, dug with bare hands until they found fur coat, then lifted her out like a rescued kitten. She weighed maybe 90 pounds soaking wet, but she clung to their necks and cried into their scarves all the way back to her vestibule. Every Christmas afterward until she died in 1968, 2 extra place settings appeared at the Rosenbaum table, one for Joey, one for Calvin, and the boys, later men with children of their own, never missed a year. Up in the Bronx, on the Grand Concourse, a delivery truck from Bohack's Grocery slid sideways and jackknifed, spilling crates of eggs across the snow. Instead of looting, neighbors formed a bucket brigade and carried every unbroken egg up 4 and 5 flights to apartments where iceboxes had been empty since Christmas dinner. By the time the driver got his rig upright again, the truck was half empty and the entire block had breakfast. The numbers, 26.4 inches, 30,000 abandoned vehicles, $100 million in lost commerce, would be argued over in city council chambers for months. But the real ledger was kept in quieter tallies. Doors dug out, kettles shared, elderly carried, children fed, strangers who became neighbors for life. The snow lingered in filthy gray ridges for weeks, but the warmth it left behind lasted far longer. For one crystalline moment, the city that prided itself on never looking up, never slowing down, never needing anyone, discovered that it still knew exactly how to take care of its own. That was the real record the Great Snow of 1947 set, one that has never been broken. Along Flatbush Avenue, the neon open signs never blinked off. Places like Dubro's Cafeteria and the Crown Luncheonette simply declared themselves public utilities. The grills stayed lit, the soup pots bubbled, and the doors stayed unlocked. Cash registers sat closed. Nobody was counting nickels when people were half frozen. A short-order cook ladled beef barley into coffee cups because the bowls had run out. Strangers passed a single Chesterfield back and forth across the Formica like old friends, listening to W New give the same useless forecast every 30 minutes. The windows fogged solid. Inside, the world felt warm, yellow, and safe. Outside was Narnia after the witch won. Out in Queens, on a wind-swept corner of Jamaica Avenue, a Flexible bus packed with 43 souls simply gave up and died. The driver kept the engine coughing just long enough to push hot air through the vents, then announced over the PA that they were officially stuck. Within minutes, porch lights started winking on up and down the block. Housewives in aprons and curlers, husbands in cardigans and galoshes came out carrying whatever Christmas had left behind. Plates of sliced turkey on Wonder Bread, still warm apple pie wrapped in wax paper, jars of pickled beets because that's what was handy. Someone produced a sled and ran a relay of coffee refills. By midnight, the passengers had been redistributed among 3 attached row houses. Coats off, shoes by the radiator, kids asleep on sofa cushions pulled to the floor. When the sun rose pale and blinding on the 27th, the former passengers formed a shovel brigade and cleared every driveway on the block before they left. One woman pressed a $10 bill into her host's hand. The host pressed it right back and said, "Buy your kids egg creams when this is over." These moments happened by the hundreds, quiet and unrecorded, except in family lore. But the city still had to eat, breathe, and read. Milk, the one delivery no 1947 household could skip, simply stopped arriving. Borden's and Sheffield Farms sent out their fleets at 3 a.m. as usual. Most never made it past the first major intersection. In an era before suburban supermarkets, the milkman was as reliable as sunrise. Now the sunrise came and the stoops stayed empty. Mothers rationed the last half pint of our cereal bowls. Corner grocers sold single quarts from the back door at triple price and still ran out by 9. In parts of Bayside and Forest Hills, kids who normally fought over the foil cap now learned to drink their coffee black. Bread went next. The big bakeries, Hector, Cushman's, Silvercup, kept the ovens roaring, but the panel trucks couldn't move. Loaves cooled on racks while just a mile away shop shelves went bare. In the Bronx Terminal Market, wooden crates of lettuce and tomatoes froze solid overnight. The smell of spoiled produce would linger into February. Even the news itself got buried. Delivery trucks for the Daily News, Mirror, and Times never left the plants, or they slid into curbs before the first bundle was thrown. Paperboys who tried to make their routes discovered that a canvas bag full of newspapers made a dandy anchor. One enterprising kid on West 83rd Street tied the bundles to his American Flyer sled. The sled sank like a stone. Most simply gave up and went outside to play. For the first time anyone could remember, thousands of New Yorkers woke up with no idea what Truman had said yesterday, what DiMaggio was demanding in contract talks, or whether the Russians had done something new and ominous. The morning paper, that secular scripture, arrived late, wet, and wrinkled, if it arrived at all. The city that prided itself on having everything instantly discovered how fragile instantly really was. One heavy snowfall had snapped the invisible threads that stretched from warehouse to kitchen table, from printing press to doorstep. For a few strange days, the most sophisticated metropolis on Earth ran on whatever was already inside the apartment when the first flake fell. And yet nobody starved, nobody froze, and nobody, despite the gripes, ever really panicked. The same hands that couldn't push a loaf of bread across Queens somehow managed to push warm food, dry socks, and kindness exactly where they were needed most. That was the deeper magic of the Great Snow of '47. It proved that beneath the chrome and neon and hurry, New York was still, at heart, a collection of small towns that happened to be stacked on top of one another. All it took was 26 inches of silence for everyone to remember. Where the big delivery trucks failed, the little guy refused to quit. Corner grocers, butchers, and candy store owners took matters into their own hands. With shovels, coal scoops, and sheer stubbornness, they hacked narrow canyons from doorway to curb, some no wider than a man's shoulders, just enough to let one customer squeeze through at a time. A flickering Coleman lantern or a single candle in the window became the new open sign. Hand-lettered placards appeared in the frost. Coffee, 5 cents. Pay when you can. Keep warm. Inside, the radio played low. The pot never went dry, and nobody was ever turned away for lack of a nickel. But the most dreamlike transformation happened at 34th Street and 34th Street. Macy's and Gimbel's, bitter rivals who had spent decades trying to outdo each other, independently came to the same decision around nightfall of the 26th. Lock the cash registers, unlock the hearts. Doors that normally closed at 6 stayed open all night. Staff dragged mattresses, box springs, and entire bedroom suites off the 7th floor displays and lined them up like an impromptu Red Cross ward. Egyptian cotton sheets, still pinned with price tags, became communal blankets. Down comforters meant for bridal registries were handed out without a second thought. On the 4th floor of Macy's, the toy department turned into a slumber party the size of a city block. Children who had been begging for a single doll now curled up with armfuls, falling asleep beneath mechanical trains that still chugged in slow circles on demonstration tracks. Exhausted parents dozed on velvet chaises under strings of colored Christmas lights that no one bothered to switch off. Security guards walked the aisles with flashlights, but instead of shooing people away, they whispered, "Sleep tight, we'll wake you when it stops." At Gimbel's across the avenue, the rug department became a Persian carpet campsite. One elderly couple celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary by spending the night on a king-size Simmons beauty rest that had been marked "Display Only, Do Not Sit." A young Marine home on leave from Camp Lejeune stood watch over the whole floor, too wired to sleep, making sure every kid had a blanket. In the diners and Horn and Hardart automats, the menu shrank to whatever was left in the walk-in. Cooks performed miracles with canned tomatoes, leftover brisket, and the last sacks of onions. The resulting blizzard hash or snowstorm stew tasted like victory. Nobody asked for separate checks. A truck driver from Jersey and a Rockefeller Center rockette shared a single piece of dried-out apple pie and argued amiably about whose turn it was to pay. In the thick cigarette haze and the hiss of the coffee urn, class, accent, and borough melted away. For a few hours, the only thing that mattered was that you were warm and not alone. Because the storm pinned everyone in place the day after Christmas, it accidentally extended the holiday itself. Trees stayed lit, candles stayed burning, gifts stayed unreturned. Families who had planned a single turkey dinner found themselves stretching the leftovers into a strange, unplanned week of togetherness. Aunts and uncles who were supposed to catch the 6:10 back to White Plains simply never left the sofa. Kids who expected to be sick of their new toys by the 27th were still playing with them on New Year's Eve because there was literally nowhere else to go. Yet for every cozy living room campout, there was a matching ache of separation. Commuters who had kissed wives and children goodbye on Christmas night, promising to be home from the city by supper, never made it back. In split levels on Long Island and bungalows in Westchester, mothers tucked children into bed with stories about how Daddy was having a big sleepover at the office. In Manhattan apartments, other mothers stared at empty chairs and listened to the radio for any word of when the trains might move again. Telephone lines stayed up, but the reassurance of a voice on the other end only went so far when you couldn't touch the person you loved. The storm didn't care about holiday schedules. It simply held the city in suspension, half enchanted, half heartbroken, until the calendar itself seemed to pause under the weight of all that quiet white. For the families who woke up to find the world sealed shut with everyone they loved already inside, the storm handed them a gift no department store could wrap: borrowed time. Alarm clocks were ignored. Offices stayed empty. The frantic post-war rhythm, catch the 7:42, punch the clock, don't be late, simply evaporated. In its place came the lazy clink of spoons against coffee cups and the soft slap of cards on the dining room table. Monopoly hotels sprouted on Baltic and Mediterranean like skyscrapers. Children who had been told, "We'll play later," 1,000 times suddenly had parents with nothing but time.
Leftover stuffing became breakfast. Ham sandwiches became lunch, and nobody complained when dinner was turkey soup for the fourth straight night. The tree stayed lit because no one was in a hurry to take it down. For one accidental week, Christmas refused to end. In a second-floor walk-up on East 98th in Brownsville, the Santangelo family discovered they had accidentally adopted half the relatives from Jersey City. 12 people, 1 bathroom, 2 decks of cards, and a percolator that never cooled. The kids built a tent city out of bed sheets and bridge chairs that occupied the entire living room. The adults told the same war stories they usually saved for Thanksgiving, only now nobody had a train to catch. Years later, the cousins would argue over whose turn it was to sleep on the ironing board, but every one of them would call it the best Christmas they ever had.
Up in Harlem, the Storm wrote a secret chapter in jazz history. At a little basement room on 118th, the kind of place that never bothered with a sign, the scheduled 2-set gig turned into a 12-hour rent party. The drummer couldn't get home to the Bronx, the pianist's cab never showed, and the handful of patrons who had come in to dodge the snow weren't going anywhere, so they kept playing. The tempo slowed to a heartbeat, then stretched into something deeper and bluesier. Someone passed around a bottle of Shenley, someone else produced a pot of neck bones from the kitchenette in back. Between choruses, the trumpet player told stories about cutting contests with Dizzy, and the room answered with hand claps and amens. When the sun finally rose, pale and stunned over a city still buried, the final note lingered in the smoky air like it never wanted to leave. On Rivington Street, a young couple named Cohen, married exactly 11 days, discovered the meaning of in sickness and in health a little earlier than planned. They had only stepped into the hall to offer slices of babka to the Rosenbergs next door when the street door jammed solid with a drift the size of a boxcar. For 36 hours, the 4 of them shared one cold water flat, 2 newlyweds, an older couple who had survived pogroms and ocean crossings, and a pot of barley soup that somehow never emptied. They played pinochle by candlelight, taught each other Yiddish and Italian phrases, and promised that if the snow ever melted, they would remain family. It did, and they did. 58 years later, Mr. Rosenberg, 93 and frail, stood under the chuppah as the godfather when the Cohens' first grandchild was named. These small, unglamorous miracles happened in thousands of living rooms, stairwells, and basement clubs. They were never reported in the papers, never tallied by the Weather Bureau, but they are the real reason the Great Snow of '47 is still spoken of with something like reverence. Eventually, though, the city had to move again. Standard plows were toys against what the storm had built. The snow had been compressed by its own weight and by the feeble overnight wind into something closer to ice than powder. So the city called in the heavy artillery. From construction yards in Jersey and Long Island came the machines that normally chewed up mountains for new highways. Gigantic Letourneau bulldozers, Alice Chalmers scrapers, Euclid dump trucks the size of bungalows. Army surplus half-tracks and weasels rumbled in from Fort Totten. Even a few Sherman tanks on loan from the National Guard growled down the avenues, their treads chewing through drifts like soft butter. Black and white newsreels show the scene. Midtown turned into a battlefield of steel. A 10-foot wall of snow across 57th Street parts like the Red Sea as a bulldozer the size of a locomotive shoulders through, showering sparks from the pavement underneath. Kids line fire escapes and cheer as if watching a parade of dinosaurs. Men in watch caps and mackinaws ride the running boards like cavalry, directing the beasts with hand signals. Slowly, grudgingly, the White Mountains are shoved into the side streets, loaded into trucks, and hauled away to the rivers. Hundreds of thousands of tons dumped into the Hudson and East River, where it melted into gray slush and drifted out to sea. It took 10 full days, and cost the city more than the entire sanitation budget for the year, but Manhattan exhaled. Taxis coughed back to life. Milk trucks rattled again. The subway steps reappeared like archaeological finds. Yet something had changed that no plow could touch. For one brief shining moment, the storm had reminded 8 million people that the person shivering next to them on the stoop, in the diner booth, or on the stranded bus was not a stranger, but a neighbor. And once you've carried someone's groceries up 5 flights, or shared your last cup of coffee with a person you'd never met before, you don't forget it. The snow melted, the headlines moved on, and the city went back to being loud, fast, and proudly impersonal.
But every time a big storm is forecast, someone who was there, or someone who heard it from someone who was there, smiles a small, private smile and says the same thing. We could use another one just like it. Because the drifts rose higher than city buses and harder than concrete, ordinary plows were useless. Pushing the snow aside would only have walled in the sidewalks and entombed whole blocks. So the only option was exile. Get it off the island entirely. For 10 straight days, the waterfront became a strange industrial ceremony. From the West Village piers to the sugar docks of Red Hook, from the 79th Street boat basin to the commercial wharves under the Brooklyn Bridge, the procession never stopped. Long lines of city-owned and privately contracted dump trucks, some still wearing their wartime olive drab, crawled to the river's edge, engines growling in low pier. At the signal, the hydraulic rams lifted and the beds tilted. Thousands of tons of snow slid off in frozen avalanches, hitting the black water with a hiss and a plume of steam that hung in the frigid air like artillery smoke.
Tugboat captains complained that the rivers ran 6 inches higher from all the added melt. Children who managed to sneak close swore they could hear the snow scream when it died. The roar replaced the silence. For the entire week between Christmas and New Year's, Manhattan never slept in the old way. Instead, it vibrated to the rumble of diesels, the crash of tailgates, the shouted orders of foremen working triple shifts under floodlights. Searchlights swept the avenues like wartime London. The city clawed itself free 1 block at a time. When the final tallies came in, the bill was staggering, roughly $100 million in 1947 dollars, well over $1 billion today, in lost wages, spoiled food, broken contracts, and emergency overtime. The port of New York had been effectively closed for days. LaGuardia and Idlewild remained shut longer than any previous weather event in aviation history. The milk shortage alone became front-page news for a week. Yet certain cash registers rang louder than ever. Hardware stores sold out of coal shovels so completely that some began renting them by the hour. Western Auto and DeVega sold every kerosene lantern, sterno can, and pair of rubber Arctic boots within a 50-mile radius. Neighborhood saloons that normally limped along in the post-holiday lull suddenly couldn't pour beer fast enough. The bar at the Biltmore did more business in 3 nights than it usually did in a month. Every hotel from the Pennsylvania to the Astor kept the no vacancy sign lit straight through New Year's Eve. But the deepest mark the storm left was invisible, and it was carved into the future. The Weather Bureau's monumental miss, predicting light snow while 26 inches fell, became a national scandal. Congressional hearings were held. Heads rolled. Within months, funding poured into new technologies that had existed only on drawing boards: a nationwide radar network, high-altitude balloon soundings, faster teletype circuits, and the first primitive computer models at Princeton and MIT. The word bombogenesis entered the lexicon because meteorologists needed a name for what had just humiliated them. The mesoscale studies that began in the storm's aftermath eventually birthed the satellites we now take for granted. Every time a modern anchor interrupts programming with a scrolling warning, every time your phone buzzes with a winter storm watch days in advance, every time Doppler shows the hook echo of a nor'easter still 300 miles offshore, some part of that system owes its existence to the morning New York woke up buried and realized the old ways were not good enough. The Great Snow of 1947 didn't just close the city for a week, it reopened the sky for the rest of the century. And on quiet winter nights, when the forecast calls for 6 to 10 inches, old-timers still smile the same private smile and mutter the same half-serious prayer. Let's have another one just like the last real one. They know the city would survive it. They also know it would remember, for a little while, who it really is. In lecture halls at MIT, Chicago, and NYU, the storm earned a permanent seat in the curriculum. Professors pinned up the hand-drawn surface charts from December 26, 1947, like crime scene photographs. There it was, in black and red grease pencil, the stationary, almost perfectly circular low parked off Long Island. The razor-sharp coastal front, the complete absence of strong pressure gradient. Students were taught to circle the date in their textbooks and underline the lesson in red. Never trust calm when the ingredients are explosive. The phrase non-blizzard blizzard entered the literature because a storm can paralyze you without ever meeting the official definition. The 1947 event became the classic illustration of mesoscale override, of bombogenesis without fanfare, of nature's ability to kill you with a whisper instead of a shout. The humiliation of the Weather Bureau's light snow forecast lit a fire under the entire profession. Within a decade, the first WSR-1 radar sets were spinning on rooftops from Texas to Maine. Upper air observation networks tripled. The first numerical models, crude, room-sized vacuum tube monsters, began churning out experimental forecasts on punch cards. Every advance that now lets us watch a storm's birth over the Atlantic 3 days in advance owes a debt to the morning the most sophisticated city on Earth woke up blind. City Hall learned harder lessons. The sanitation department's fleet of 1947, mostly converted garbage trucks with angle blades, was quietly scrapped. In its place came a new generation of machines, V-plows, wing plows, rotary blowers that could throw snow 30 feet, and an armada of front-end loaders painted the now familiar orange. Salt barns were built on every borough's edge. The phrase snow emergency routes entered the municipal code. River disposal became an engineered operation, complete with designated dump sites and Coast Guard coordination. The modern winter city, pre-treating streets, declaring parking bans days ahead, tagging cars for towing before the first flake falls, was born in the hangover of that single storm. Culturally, the romance with snow died a little that week. Before 1947, a big snowfall still carried the glow of sleds and sleigh bells. After 1947, New Yorkers looked at a forecast of 12 inches the way sailors once looked at a falling barometer, with respect bordering on dread. The Courier and Ives postcard was replaced by the cost-benefit analysis.
But ask the people who were there, the ones who were 10 or 12 or 20 in 1947, now in their 80s and 90s, and the numbers dissolve. They remember the way the light turned pearl gray and never quite became day. They remember the first time they stepped outside after the fall stopped and the silence hit them like a physical force. No horns, no brakes, no shouting, just their own breath echoing off the buildings. They remembered the city looking soft for the first and only time in their lives, the brutal angles of skyscrapers rounded into gentle hills, the yellow glow of street lamps floating in spheres of frost like a million small moons. Most of all, they remembered the doors that opened. the neighbor who suddenly had a first name, the stranger who handed over half a sandwich without being asked, the night the entire block crowded into one apartment because Mrs. O'Leary on the third floor had the only working fireplace and nobody wanted her to sit alone.
The way the whole furious, rushing, look-straight-ahead city was forced to stop, look around, and realize the person next to them was another human being trying to stay warm. That is the part no textbook can chart and no budget can quantify. The Great Snow of 1947 is remembered as the week the sky fell on New York, and the city, for one crystalline moment, remembered how to catch one another. As the calendar flipped to 1948, the Great Christmas Storm slipped quietly from headline to legend. It became one of those stories New Yorkers tell with the same half-smile they save for the Dodgers leaving Brooklyn or the night the lights came back on after the blackout. Something that happened to us, something that proved who we are. In the slow thaw of early January, as the city limped back to its old tempo, a strange afterglow lingered in the air. It wasn't just the squeak of packed snow under galoshes or the distant rumble of the last bulldozers.
It was quieter than that. A shared, wordless understanding that 8 million people had lived through the same impossible week and come out the other side a little softer around the edges. The rush returned. The horns began honking again. The subway roared back to life. But for a while, strangers met one another's eyes a fraction longer, and nobody rushed past a stuck door without offering a shoulder. The storm had arrived without drama, without the howling prelude people expected from a monster. It simply persisted, patient and relentless, the way real power often does. It taught the city that the most profound forces don't always announce themselves with thunder. Sometimes they speak in the accumulated hush of millions of falling flakes. For weeks afterward, children treated the remaining snow mountains like conquered territory. Fifth Avenue still had 10-foot walls flanking the sidewalks well into February. Kids tunneled through them, built thrones on top, and raced sleds down the narrow lanes sanitation crews had carved. Adults walked a little slower, partly from caution, partly from the unfamiliar pleasure of having nowhere urgent to be.
Laughter carried farther in the cold, clear air, and even the most hardened commuters occasionally stopped to watch their breath rise like smoke signals against a sky scrubbed clean. 78 years on, the blizzard of 47 remains a fixed star in New York's firmament, a gentle, stubborn reminder that the loudest city on earth can be silenced, that steel and concrete can be humbled, and that when everything else is buried, what's left is the people underneath. When the clouds finally parted on the morning of December 27th, New Yorkers stepped out into a city they no longer recognized, and yet somehow recognized more deeply than ever. The sun, low and fierce, struck the fresh snow and turned the island into a blinding diamond. Every surface threw back light so intense it hurt to look directly at it. The jagged skyline had been softened. The brutal heights of Midtown seemed lower, their bases swallowed by rolling white seas that lapped at second-story windows. Streets were no longer streets, but wide, unmarked expanses, smooth, wind-sculpted fields where yellow cabs and delivery trucks lay half-interred like ancient artifacts. Only the occasional antenna or side-view mirror betrayed their presence, poking up like periscopes from a frozen ocean. Fire hydrants were myths. Mailboxes were rumors. The ornate iron railings of subway entrances had vanished entirely, replaced by smooth slopes that led to black holes no one dared approach without a rope. The garish holiday colors, the crimson boughs on lampposts, the emerald wreaths in windows, The flashing neon of theater marquees had all been painted over in the same luminous white. For one crystalline day, Manhattan looked like the inside of a shaken snow globe that had finally been allowed to settle. People stood on stoops and rooftops, squinting into the glare, and did something rare. They simply looked. No one hurried. There was nowhere to hurry to. The city that never stopped had been granted, for one bright, aching moment, permission to stand still and see itself anew. Thank you for walking these buried streets with me, for letting the hush settle around us as we remembered a New York wrapped in white, and, for a little while, wrapped around one another. If this story brought back your own memories of blizzards past, of neighbors who became friends over a shared shovel, of a winter night when the world felt both fragile and unbreakable, drop them in the comments below. I read every one. Wherever you are this holiday season, stay warm, stay kind, and keep an ear open for the quiet sound of snow beginning to fall. Sometimes it's still trying to tell us something. As the sun climbed higher and the first blinding glare softened, wonder gave way to a colder realization. The city hadn't just been decorated, it had been occupied. Sanitation men who had fought all night with little more than brooms and rock salt came back at dawn and simply stood at the mouths of side streets, staring up at walls of snow that rose above their heads. Their trucks, sturdy Mack chain drives with 8-foot blades, looked like toys against drifts the size of brownstones. In the narrow canyons of Greenwich Village and the financial district, the plows couldn't even turn around. They were boxed in by their own earlier feudal passes.
Engines coughed and died in the cold. In some blocks, the mechanical age quietly surrendered, and men went back to pickaxes, coal shuttles, and raw fury. The numbers sounded impossible until you saw them with your own eyes. Central Park's official 26.4 inches was tidy and clinical. Out on the streets, the snow had been sculpted by every eddy between buildings into monstrous asymmetrical ridges. West 23rd Street recorded an 8-foot drift against the Chelsea Hotel. Parts of Delancey had 12-foot walls. When the big plows finally punched through the avenues, they left behind corridors so deep and narrow that crossing from one side to the other required ladders in some places. Mayor O'Dwyer went on WNYC and declared a full emergency, the first peacetime use of the phrase in anyone's memory. Every city employee who could swing a shovel was reassigned. Beat cops traded nightsticks for picks. Firemen who had spent the night carrying hoses on their backs now carried 50-pound blocks of ice. Transit workers who normally collected tokens spent their shifts hacking subway stairs free, one step at a time. Schools stayed dark into the new year.
The stock exchange opened late and traded sluggishly, as if even money was half frozen. In Brownsville and Red Hook, people literally climbed out second-floor windows onto snowbanks because front doors were buried solid. Kids thought it was hilarious. Parents measured the drift against the mailbox and felt something close to panic. City Hall admitted defeat within 36 hours and sent up the flare. Private contractors were sworn in as auxiliary sanitation troops. Steam shovels, bulldozers, and conveyor rigs, normally used to dig subway tunnels, were dragged out of mothballs. The Army Corps of Engineers lent half-tracks and weasels. At the peak, more than 10,000 sanctioned workers and countless unsanctioned neighbors moved an estimated 100 million cubic feet of snow, enough to fill the Empire State Building 30 times over. Most of it went straight into the rivers. From the piers at West 14th to the sugar docks in Brooklyn, the parade lasted a week. Dump trucks reversing to the edge, beds rising, avalanches of white plunging into the gray water with a sound like distant artillery. The Hudson ran thick with slush for miles. A brutal cold wave locked in behind the storm, turning cleared streets into skating rinks and the remaining piles into granite. Patches of the great snow survived in alleyways until cherry blossoms were blooming uptown. The final bill, cleanup, lost commerce, spoiled goods, overtime, topped $100 million in 1947 dollars, a sum so staggering it required special appropriations and bond issues. Heads rolled at the Weather Bureau and the Department of Sanitation. Blue ribbon panels were formed. Budgets were rewritten overnight. Out of that frozen chaos came the modern winter city. The orange phalanx of today's plows, the brine trucks that pre-treat before the first flake, the tiered emergency declarations, the tow truck brigades that clear snow emergency routes while the storm is still offshore. Every time a mayor stands in the garage at Hamilton Avenue and vows, "We are ready," he is standing on ground purchased by the helplessness of December 1947. The snow is long gone, but the lesson is still plowed into the streets every winter. New York can be brought to its knees by something as gentle as falling flakes, if it forgets to respect them.
And every once in a while, when a forecast calls for a foot or more, someone who remembers, or someone who heard it from someone who remembers, looks up at the sky and feels, for just a second, the old hush waiting to return. In the end, the Christmas blizzard of 1947 did far more than etch a number on a record board. It held a mirror up to 8 million souls and asked, without raising its voice, who they really were when the lights dimmed and the machines stopped. And New York answered the only way it knows how, together, stubbornly, one shovelful at a time. For weeks afterward, strangers greeted each other on half-cleared sidewalks with the easy nod of veterans who had shared the same foxhole. Shopkeepers swept their patches of pavement a little wider than necessary just to keep the path open for the old woman from 3B. Conversations in delis and elevators lingered a sentence or two longer because no one was quite ready to let go of the strange intimacy the snow had forced on them.
The city that prides itself on never sleeping had been tucked in for 3 full days, and when it woke up, it carried the memory of that long, enforced rest like a secret it wasn't eager to give up. Other storms would come, some louder, some windier, some with fancier names, but none would ever quite match the quiet, perfect surprise of 1947. None would fall so gently and conquer so completely. None would leave behind so many private legends. The night Macy's became a dormitory, the marathon jam session in a Harlem basement, the couple married 11 days who celebrated their honeymoon sharing one candle with neighbors they'd never met. It became one of those rare moments every New Yorker owns a piece of, even those born decades later. A communal "where were you when" that needs no further explanation. A child asleep under a row of teddy bears in the toy department. A sailor from Iowa curled up under a grand piano in Penn Station. A sanitation man who shoveled until his hands bled and then kept going because Mrs.
Rizzo on the 4th floor still hadn't seen her son come home. So as we close the book on this snowy night, picture Manhattan in the first pale light after the fall stopped. Street lamps still glowing amber through a haze of suspended crystals, steam curling from manhole covers like incense. The avenues lying impossibly wide and empty, glittering under a sky rinsed clean. And then the first set of footprints appearing, tentative, deliberate, breaking the perfect crust. One set becomes 10, becomes 100, becomes a slow, steady river of people stepping out into the cold, breath rising, shovels over shoulders, ready to take their city back. That is the final image of the Christmas blizzard of 1947. Not the snow itself, but the people walking through it,
boots crunching, hearts open, certain of only one thing. Whatever winter throws at them next, they'll face it the same way, together. Thank you for letting me tell you this story, for walking these hushed, buried streets with me, for listening to the quiet the way New York once did.
If it stirred something in you, an old memory, a new appreciation for the neighbor you barely nod at, or just the simple wish for a gentler winter, leave it in the comments. I read them all. Wherever you are tonight, may your hearth be warm, your company close, and may a few soft flakes find your windowsill now and then, just enough to remind you what silence sounds like. And if they ever start falling thick and fast again, well, you know what to do. Open the door, offer the shovel, share the coffee. The city will remember how.